This is John Lauder, host of The Cheap Seats. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hey, it's Baxter Colburn here from Public House Media. Did you know that we just added a store here at Public House Media? No, I'm not talking about a grocery store where you can go buy apples or bananas or peanut butter, which are all fantastic, especially when peanut butter's on all of those. Anyway, we've added a store here at Public House Media so you can not only come and represent your favorite podcast network, but also represent your favorite shows as well, too. Just go over to thephmedia.com and look in the top right corner where you'll see the button that says Store. Click on that and you can search through all of our great products. Or if you go to our Facebook page, Public House Media, you can see on the left-hand side a tab that says Store. All of our products are listed there as well too. It's the new Public House Media store. You don't want to miss it. It is fantastic. Buy some of that great swag to support your favorite shows and to support Public House Media. Check it out today.
How's it going, everybody? This is Keith.
And Katie, hosts of Coffee with Keith and Katie, here on Public House Media.
Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. When you're done here, I hope you'll check out our show, Coffee with Keith and Katie,
where we talk about our lives and relationship over a cup of coffee.
A new episode airs on Facebook Live every Monday and Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you'll never miss an episode of Coffee with Keith and Katie.
Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppie. Find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. You can follow How to Write Good on Facebook or Twitter. You can like and share the stuff. But if you really want to find out anything about How to Write Good or anything connected to it, you can just go to danielpoppie.com. How to Write Good is brought to you by Public House Media, and if you want to read something that's a little more organized than this, but is similar to this, it's not the exact same thing because I don't want to be doing the exact same thing all the time. I want to do something different. What's the point of trying to be creative if you're always doing the exact same thing? I'm looking at you, authors who only write one book again and again and again, just in a different situation. You can check out my website because I have a blog. That's where I'm getting. So I have to apologize to you because 2 weeks ago there was some miscommunication. There was a podcast episode that was supposed to go out. It was all ready. There was miscommunication. I'll just be honest. I dropped the ball a little bit and the podcast episode didn't go out. Okay, it should have gone out. So I just think that if you're someone who listens to a podcast and this podcast, it's on episode, I don't even remember. Something. It's pretty high up there. It's kind of weird how far it's gone, how long it's gone at least. And if you listen to something, you expect, it's going to be there the exact same time every single week, and it's going to be consistent. And I just want to apologize that it wasn't there. I think that I am responsible to you because I put something out and you're like, well, I trust that he's going to put something out, something that I like. And I just want to apologize, and that's all. And I hope that you will forgive me for that because I certainly didn't mean it to happen. It just did. And I don't want it to happen again. And I never intend it to happen again. It's not going to happen again if it's within my power. There's certain things that I think are reasonable for that to happen, but not many things. So, without further ado, we are going to jump into our word of the week, and our word of the week is risk. So risk is a pretty common word. You should know what it is. If you're a native English speaker, there might be somebody who isn't a native English speaker. Risk means exposed to danger, harm, or loss. So as I stated before, I'm going to start giving the etymology of a word. And if you don't know what the etymology of a word is, maybe you've never heard of that, it means the history of the word because it makes it more interesting. So risk comes from Italian. So rischiare. I don't know how to speak Italian, so I'm trying my best, which means run into danger, or risco, which means danger. So that makes a lot of sense because that sounds exactly like the word. So I'm guessing that risk came from French because English is a Germanic language, and it borrows from French because the French conquered England, and then they imposed their language on England. And so England, the English language, the people who spoke it were like, well, we're not going to give up our language. So they just incorporated French words into theirs. I don't think they did it I don't think they said we're not going to give up our language. They probably didn't do it consciously. They just are like, well, we're just going to incorporate these words in and speak our same language. Maybe because they're lazy, or maybe because they just do things differently. The Anglosphere tends to do things differently than mainland Europe. So risk, these two words come from possibly from resecco, which is Latin, which means to cut off, to cut loose. I think this is really interesting. So this is something that, this is a word, a part of a word that may not necessarily, they don't know if this is actually where the word comes from. They're making their best guess. But what this means is cut off, cut loose. So if you are talking about boats, when a boat is in danger, you start cutting stuff off and you throw stuff off the boat so it's more buoyant, right? So that's where that would come from. So that is our word of the week. And we are going to jump into our accidental essence. And we are going to be talking about learning how to fail. And this is something that I still have to learn. This is preaching to the choir, as it were. You know, when you're talking about something and it really hits home with you, learning how to fail is something that I've been trying to do for years. It's something that I realized probably a few years ago that it's necessary to be able to do, but it's something that I'm just trying at, and something that I have a hard time doing. And you're going to understand what I mean by that in a little bit. So we are going to talk about failure. And you might be asking, why are we going to talk about failure? And some of you are going to be like, well, of course we're going to talk about failure. This makes perfect sense. But some of you might be like, well, we want to succeed, don't we? We're going to talk about failure because I had an epiphany, okay? I had an epiphany, and I think that I didn't know what I was going to do for this show. And I just kept on thinking about it. I kept on just letting my mind go over stuff. And I've just been looking at what I've been going through. And I'm like, I think other people need to hear this as well. So I'm an anxious person, right? I've talked about this before. I get anxious about things. I get anxious about making things. And I get anxious about putting myself out there like I am right now. So the fact that I'm out here is a minor miracle, okay? And so because I'm anxious, I'm averse to failure. So our word of the week is risk. Risk is to expose to harm or loss. If you're an anxious person, for whatever reason, your brain is saying, hey, avoid this danger, avoid this danger, avoid this danger. And that makes you not want to go near risky things. So when I was in school, because I always have to go back to my own childhood because, you know, this is a Freudian show, people. When I was in school, when I didn't learn something well, so when I did fail in something, I fell into learned helplessness. And if you don't know what learned helplessness, this is the best example, but I'll explain it a little more after this example. So there was this psychology experiment, because everything comes from psychology, yada, yada, yada. There's this psychology experiment where they put dogs in a box or something. They made it so they couldn't get out of something. They made it so the walls were too high. I'm not sure exactly the parameters. I'm not sure exactly the things that went into it. And what they did is they shocked the dogs, and or maybe it was mice. I'm getting really confused. I'm almost certain it was dogs. They shocked the dogs, and the dogs could not move. Okay, so they gave. Let me restart. They gave one group of dogs a way to stop something, and they gave another group of dogs a way not to stop something. So the one group of dogs couldn't do anything, and the other group of dogs could do something about it to stop it. And the group of dogs that could do something, this is a paraphrase of this study. So if you know what this study is in detail, I'm butchering it probably. I'm almost certainly butchering it. But they shocked the dogs, and the dogs that could do something stopped it because they were able to do something, and the dogs that couldn't ended up just lying down and being shocked. And that's what learned helplessness is. So it's where you fail at something, and instead of actually trying again and again and keeping on fighting against something, you just give up. You're like, well, this is what happens. This is how it is. I'm just going to do this because I can't do anything about my situation. That's learned helplessness. That's what learned helplessness is, and I'm having a hard time talking. It's been a while since I've had a hard time talking. So my failure in school when I was a kid, and even I guess in high school as well, led me to being learned helplessness. I didn't fail very often, right? I wanted good grades, but how it worked is how schools are shifting this. Not every school does it like this, but schools are shifting more toward you need a specific skill, and if you can show that skill, then you get a good grade. Some schools are, not all. But there's ideas in education that are shifting more toward that idea, where it's just skills based. But how it's set up and how it was set up when I was a kid was you got a grade, and you had to maintain that grade across the semester, no matter how little you knew about that. So if you wanted a perfect grade and you knew nothing about mathematics and you sucked at mathematics, which I didn't suck at mathematics, but I wasn't the best person at mathematics in school, by no means. I wasn't that good at math. I'm not that good at math. What happened is you started off and you tried to get really good grades at first, or this is what happened for me. I started to get really good grades at first, and then I would get a bad grade, and I'm like, well, I mean, I can't do anything about that bad grade, and so I would just be like, well, that's how it is, so I shouldn't worry about getting a good grade anymore. That's learned helplessness, because I'm saying, well, I can't do anything about it, so I should just accept my situation. So for writing and people reading my writing, through when I was a kid, I always, because I'm higher anxiety level than most people. I think I am. Maybe I'm not. I don't know. Part of me thinks I'm not. Part of me thinks a lot of people deal with like worrying about stuff and they just don't show it, or they don't tell people, or they're too afraid to tell people. And I don't really care. I really don't care anymore, because I don't know, like, it sucks to be, well, it sucks to be like, well, this is me, and I never worry about anything because I worry about stuff all the time. Let's just be honest. Come on. So for writing and people reading my writing, I also have this aversion because there's a risk involved if people read your writing, right? So writing itself is nothing. Like, you can write and I can write, and it doesn't matter if nobody reads my writing, it doesn't matter. But once somebody reads my writing, they can see, oh, there is there's something wrong with this writing. Okay? Now, with creativity, there's creativity for me was kind of my oasis, okay, in terms of this stuff, because I worried as a kid. I think I've talked about that in the past, but I worried as a kid, and I worried more than I do now. But as a kid, I just learned to write, and I learned to be creative, because in creativity, there isn't a boundary. All right, and I think there's a friend of mine from high school had liked a quote from Einstein saying that something about how creativity is endless, or something like that. Creativity doesn't actually have a boundary. I think it takes a level of intelligence to be creative, or be very creative and be unique in creativity, but it's a very human thing. So I think everybody shows a degree of creativity in what they do, and I've talked about this already. But when I'm writing, I don't worry, because I have this creativity that I can engage in. But for when I start to present my writing to somebody else, I get nervous. When I start to be critical about it, when I start to say, well, will anybody like this, I get nervous. Okay. I'm just gonna have a quick side note. So schools, there's kind of a paradox in schools right now. There's this idea that, so we're talking about failure, and this connects directly with what you're talking about, but I want to kind of take a side note. So there's this thing in schools. Within schools, if you ask a teacher, should a kid be allowed to retake something or redo something? And a lot of teachers will say no, because they're like, well, in real life, you don't get a second chance. In real life, if you fail at something, you're going to get fired from your job, etc. You know, you could probably fill in the blank. You can't. So they say, oh, you can't fail in a real job. But the thing about teachers is they say, oh, you should try a lot of stuff and you should learn, and failure is a part of learning. That's what they say. But at the same time, they say, oh, well, you can't fail in a real job. If you fail at on this test, you should just get a bad grade. You shouldn't be able to retake it. They don't think about the fact that the kid may not have been as mature at the beginning of the school year as at the end, and the kid might be like, well, I really, really want a good grade. So they say that, and then they also say, well, you should be able to you should be able to try stuff, and you should be able to fail, because you shouldn't worry about failing, man, gosh. So there's a bit of a paradox with teachers. And what I think is that school is a place where you should be able to fail. And the reason why you should be able to fail is because what the teachers have assumed is absolutely wrong. Now, there are certain situations in a job where you cannot fail. So if you're an air traffic controller, you better not fail, because you're going to kill somebody. If you're a doctor, if you're a surgeon, if you fail, you may kill somebody. There's really high-level jobs where you can't fail. But the funny thing about it is that when I talk to a lot of teachers, I've heard this from multiple people. You don't actually learn how to teach until you've been teaching about 5 years. So a teacher, ironic, a teacher has been failing 4 years before they've actually gotten the hang of what they're doing. which is funny that some of them say, oh, you shouldn't be allowed to retake something, because you're kind of allowed to retake your whole entire job multiple years in a row, and it's dealing with kids and it's dealing with teaching kids. But I digress. So connecting this back to failure, some of us, and I think a lot of us, feel an impending doom about life. I think that a lot of us are we worry more than we think we do. We maybe don't realize we worry, or we're just like, oh, we worry all the time, right? I think that a lot of people do worry. I think that a lot of people have this sense like, man, I've just got to do this, and I can't take these risks because of what might happen. I think this is probably especially true. You like my use of two adverbs right there? I don't care. I think this is especially true with millennials, and this is why. And it's not because I think millennials probably worry more than people in the past, and I'm going to explain why. And you're probably going to agree with me afterwards. And I'm assessing this based on my life and based on people I know and looking around. So before my generation, because I have siblings who are not in my generation. They're old enough to not be in my generation. Before my generation, there was a push towards college, but there was less of a push towards college. Excuse me. There's less of a push towards college in my siblings' generation who are older than me than there was in my generation. Because in my generation, when you went to school, there was maybe I'm wrong though, because I haven't lived my siblings' lives, but there seems to be more of a push. There seems to be a push. But in my siblings' generation, it seemed to be the case that it's like you must go to college to get a job, right? And if you're a millennial, you know how that worked out for a lot of you. Now, some of you went to school and you got something that's marketable. That's excellent. Now, if you got something that's marketable and you're listening to this, you should sponsor the show. No, I'm just kidding. So if you got something marketable, that's great. Excellent. But there's a lot of people who were told, oh yeah, you can just get a degree and get a job. And they were stupid and they were young. It was a bad thing they were told. They were told that if you get a degree, you get a job. But the issue is that everybody was getting a degree, so the value of a degree went down. Makes sense, right? Supply and demand. If their demand is really high, the price associated with that demand is lower. The demand goes up. If the supply is really high, I'm sorry about that. If the supply is really high, the demand goes down. And that's what happened with a lot of people. And then a lot of people came out of school and they knew what to do for writing papers. They knew what to do for school stuff. And they've been doing school stuff forever, but they didn't have any skills they could apply to the workforce. And people who were hiring knew that. So I think a lot of millennials, I think it's good for the millennial generation, actually. I think it's going to end up being good for the millennial generation. And if I have time, I'll explain why. But maybe I'll have another episode to talk about that. So a lot of millennials came out of college and they have tens of thousands of dollars in debt, maybe like 50 grand in debt. And if you have 50 grand in debt and you get a job where you're making $12 an hour, you probably have a sense of impending doom about your life, you know? You're probably like, oh crap, what am I going to do? Now you could default on your loans and be a crapper. I was going to say something else, but I can't swear. You could default on your loans, but if you're a responsible person, you're like, man, I want to pay that back. I want to be responsible. I want to be successful. I think most people want to be successful. I think everybody wants to be successful. I don't know if everybody wants to do the work to be successful, but I think everybody wants to be successful. Now, that's why I think millennials probably have more of a sense of impending doom than even people who are 10 years older than them, people who are 15 years older than them. Because first, they came out of college in a really bad job market, so it was hard to get a job. And a lot of them came out of college, and I'm just going to say I did because I did. Came out of college with jobs with a degree that you couldn't apply directly to a job that was a good job. Okay? So, I mean, why wouldn't you worry, right? It's not like you're buying a house. It's not like you have anything to show for what you did. You have a big, huge loan to pay. Now, don't feel bad about that because I think this will actually make you feel better. And I actually think that, okay, I'm going to say my thing about millennials, then I'll go on. So I think it might be good that millennials are really in debt if you actually take responsibility for your debt. Because it will help you teach your kids, when you have kids, that, hey, just because you go to college doesn't mean you are going to get a job from college. You have to think differently than other people. I think it's actually going to put, and I think it has, I think it actually is going to push a lot of millennials to be entrepreneurs. I really think it has already. I see people around me. I don't see a lot of people around me. So if you are someone who is trying to do something and you know me, then don't worry about it because I probably see that you're doing something. But I don't see everyone around me doing that. I don't see everyone trying to be an entrepreneur. But I think that millennials are going to be like, man, I can't keep on going on like that. I've got to do something about my life. I've got to do something about my job situation. And I have to take responsibility for my job situation. So I think they're going to be pushed toward entrepreneurship, entrepreneurialism. It's really hard to say for me. Entrepreneurialism, and they're going to be doing something by themselves, and they're going to figure it out. So if you're a millennial, don't worry. Just start thinking as if you're responsible for your own income and someone else isn't. So along with the entrepreneurialism, along with talking about this impending doom, you need to allow yourself to fail in life, and especially in art. Okay? Now, there's certain areas you probably don't want to fail, and there's certain areas I don't want to fail in a major way. But the reason why I want you to allow yourself to fail is so that you can fail in small ways, so you don't fail in a huge major way. Because someone who is afraid of failure thinks like this. So what they do, and I'm afraid of failure, so I can tell you what it's like. What they do is there's two modes of thinking for this. There's my way of thinking, where it's like where you fall into mediocrity. So you try something and you fail at that thing and you think, well, I kind of suck at that. And you're still afraid of failure. So you're like, well, I failed at this, so I don't think I'm capable of this, so I'm just going to give up on this. And then there's another set of people who are afraid of failure who are the perfectionists. This is the other. They're related because I'm also in this group too, but in a different way. I'll explain how. The perfectionists get everything right, but they never actually learn to fail. They never have actually failed. So they are risk averse, but they're risk averse in a way where they have to manage every single risk in their life, which will lead to burnout. So don't be a perfectionist if you are. Try to be not to be a perfectionist because you're so afraid of failure, you can't fail. You can't get one thing wrong. What this leads to for both people, I think, is hiding failure. So if you are someone who falls into learned helplessness, you're probably going to fail and you're not going to want to show anybody else your failure. So for me, it took me a really, really long time in my life before I showed anybody what I wrote. And it took a really, really long time in my life before I made a podcast. I think I've been thinking about making a podcast for at least a year before I made it. So it's been maybe 2, maybe 3. I don't know. It's probably been in my mind for a long time, but there's always been that what if I fail thing. So I'm afraid to do it. But if I did start to fail at something, so if I started something and I failed, or if I made one mistake, I'd want to hide that mistake, and I continue hiding the mistakes until it's something that builds up, as opposed to just owning up to that mistake. Now, I've learned from my past mistakes. I've learned how to fail more and more I've learned how to fail more and more in my life, so it isn't the case where that happens. But for someone who's a perfectionist, I think this is likely to happen more. They fail in one thing, and they have like this. They accidentally fail, and they never tell anybody. And maybe they fail in a small way, and then the small way leads to something bigger. I know that this could, like, if you ever become a politician, really high level politician, this is something that you may fall into, and this is something that could be really drastic. Actually, this could be really drastic for a teacher too, if you think about it, because I'm in the teaching sphere, so I think about teaching. For a politician, you may fail in a really small way, and you may not own up to that failure and correct it. And that failure may cascade into something huge, right? In the same way, if you're a teacher, you may fail in a small way. You may forget to do something. You may forget to, I don't know, you may teach something wrong, something that's necessary, but you teach it wrong, and at first it's like, well, it's something small, they'll catch on, but you never correct yourself. You never say, hey, I failed, we need to reteach this. You never actually own up to your failure, and the kids never learn that thing that's basic, so they can't learn things that are higher level. For writing, if you don't own up to your failures, you're never going to be a better writer. Okay? In your life, I think you need failure. I think you need to be like, yes, I am allowed to fail. Okay? And in art, you especially need to allow yourself to fail, because you can't, like, it's all about risk. It's all about risk. If you want to be successful, you cannot play it safe. Okay, now you can't risk everything. You can't just be like, well, I'm going to play the lottery and get successful, because the lottery is extremely risky. I think there's a statistic where if you go and buy a lottery ticket, you're more likely to actually get killed in a car accident than actually win the lottery. So the lottery is an extremely risky thing. But if you want to be successful, you have to take risks. Okay, and you might be saying like, Dan, you're not super successful, but it makes sense. Okay, this is something that is very basic and logical to me. All right. If you want to write, if let's just take this podcast, for example. If I want to be successful at this podcast, I need to be willing to look at what I've done in the past. I need to be willing to say, hey, I don't really do this really well. So I failed in that area, and then I need to correct that. On top of that, if I ever wanted to make money off this podcast. So right now I'm not, and that's fine. I don't care. Well, I'd like to. That'd be really cool. But it's not the most important thing on my mind right now. Okay? But if I wanted to, I'd have to go up to people and I'd have to be like, hey, would you like to sponsor this podcast? Because that's how you do stuff with podcasts. Or I would have to be like, hey, do you want to buy this thing from me? So I either have to sell something to you, which I'm writing a book, so I'm technically going to be selling something to you. Let's just be honest about that. So if you wanted to buy my book, I mean, that's awesome. So me mentioning in my book is kind of like selling something to you. It's a little different though. But if I got a sponsor, I'd have to go up and be like, hey, would you want to sponsor this podcast? There's a chance the person would say no. But it's a risk. It's like a risk of me hurting my pride. If I want to be better at this podcast, I may have to allow someone who's more experienced podcasting to listen to the podcast and be like, hey, Dan, you don't do this well, you don't do this well, you don't do this well, you don't do this well. And I might be like, okay, I don't do those things well. I need to correct those things. I failed at those things, and I need to do something about it. So I have to take a risk to do that. If you want to make money in the stock market, you have to put money up. If you want to start a business, you have to have capital. You have to have money to start that business. You have to risk your money. If you want to start a business where you use very little money, so you use a few $1,000, which is barely anything, okay? A few $1,000 is barely anything for starting a business. The more I look into it, the more I'm like, wow, that's nothing. If you want to do that, you have to risk that little amount, but you have to also have to risk your time, okay? There's no guarantee what you're doing is gonna take off. There's no guarantee what you're doing is going to work out. But you might be thinking, well, that's dumb. Like, if there's no guarantee, why would I do that? Shouldn't I just stay in my safe little bubble? Shouldn't I get a job working for somebody else and they can take care of the risk and they don't have to deal with it? Here's the thing. You shouldn't go jumping off of bridges, right? You should take calculated risks as you go about things in your creativity. So if you're a creative person, you should take risks in your creativity, because creativity is one of those things where if you take risks, the risk is super small and the payoff is huge. It's like an investment where it's really low risk investment, but it's like buying Apple in the 80s. It's buying shares for Apple in the 80s, because you may create something. Look at the art world today. You may create something that somebody sees and they're like, wow, I really like that. That really connects to me. Not that you shouldn't be critical about your art. Not that you shouldn't try your best, but you shouldn't be like, well, I have to do it this way because everybody does it this way. I would say that the book I'm writing, the book I just finished, it's finished. The book I'm finished, probably going to be out in July. I'll tell you when it's out. There'll be an announcement if you want to read it. The book I finished is a risk because I'm writing it in a different way. Can't talk right now. In a different way than everybody else writes their own books. I want to have multiple books for the one that's coming out in July. I'll just say it's coming out in July. And I want the story arc to go through the whole thing. So you may read one book and say, well, that wasn't completed. There wasn't a complete story arc, but I'm trying something different. I'm risking something. And the payoff could be huge. And what happens if the payoff isn't huge? Well, people couldn't like my book, and they may be like, well, I don't really like this author. But the thing about me writing a book or you trying something, so if you're like, hey, I'm worried about the risk, maybe I'll fail. The thing about failure is you're allowed to try again and again and again and again. Okay? So if you're someone who is a writer and you want to actually publish a book, well, if you write a book a year, which is reasonable, and you get a book published a year, every single year, let's just self-publish your books. Come on. Like it's feasible now. If you self-publish a book every single year, just one book, and you actually do it right. So you go through the process and you do give your best, you put your best work out, and you get all the errors out of the book. So you're getting all the proofreading done. You're getting something that looks like a final product. So the final product is important for stuff. And you're putting that out into the market, and you take 15 years, and every year you write one book. You've got 15 books out of there. So every book you put out, well, first off, if anybody reads those books, they're going to be paying you essentially because they're buying your book. But also, every book you put out will give you a chance to actually have more people read your book, because more people will be able to find it and it'll pop up, and maybe somebody will like one of your books and not another. The thing about authors I read is that I don't like all their books. You got to remember that. I don't like all the paintings of the painters I like. I like art. I've talked about it in the past. You already know this. I don't like the stupid sunflowers by Van Gogh, but I like a lot of his other stuff. The sunflowers look like crap. But you're allowed to try again and again. Say you're starting a business. Why not? You might be like, well, starting a business is hard. Starting a business takes a lot of money. And I was thinking that 6 months ago. I'm like, starting a business is so much money. But with technology, you can start a really, really small business for barely any money. You don't have to put up tons and tons of money to start a business. You just got to be creative. You just got to think, how can I make money using the internet? Because you'd be using the internet. How can I use that to make money in a way that doesn't take a lot of money? And then you can use the money you make from that to build a business. But you may fail. You may start a business online and you may fail. Well, start 9 more businesses. It's likely that one is going to succeed. Fail once. Look at why you failed. Try again, smarter this time, and keep on failing until you get smart enough to actually succeed. And I think that's why you have to be willing to be risky, because you have to see the world in a different way. So instead of saying, oh, there's a risk, I could fail, be like, yep, I could fail and I could try 20 more times. And I have a chance I'm going to succeed every single one of those times. I'm flipping a coin. There's a chance I won't succeed. There's always a chance I won't succeed, but I'm increasing my chances that I'm going to succeed if I work my butt off. And maybe, just maybe, this is the one that's going to take off. And you only need one idea to really take off. If you had 10 ideas and you're like, I'm going to try every single one of them, I'm going to try them one at a time, and the 10th one takes off and the 10th one makes you tons of money, then you don't have to worry, do you? Or you could have 10 ideas and you can make a little money from each of them, right? So, I don't know. That's just what I wanted to talk about today. I think that I think being worried about failure is just something that, well, I've dealt with it in the past, and I'm sure there's other people who are listening who deal with it as well. I think that some people deal with it worse than others. Some people worry a lot more than me. Some people worry a lot less than me. But it's just something I wanted to share, because maybe you are someone who's like, man, I've got a lot of ideas. Because that's who I was. That's who I've always been, I'm pretty sure. But now that I think back to it, I've always had tons of ideas that I just wanted to do stuff with. I've always wanted to go out on my own and do stuff. But there's always been this thought in the back of my mind. It's like, what if you fail? What if you make a fool of yourself? And I've gotten to a point where I'm like, who cares? I guess I fail. And I've gotten to a point, so even 3 months ago, I thought, well, what if I try for 50 years? Yeah, what if I try for 50 years and it never works? What if everything fails? Then I'm a failure. But I don't think that's the case. I've changed my mind about that. If I try for 50 years and everything fails and continues to fail for 50 years, but I still keep on trying, I think I've shown more perseverance than most people have in their entire life. Because despite the fact that I failed, I kept on going. So I've changed my mind about that, and I think that you should too. I think that you should be like, well, risk is a part of life, and I accept risk, and I'm going to give myself the best chance amidst this risk. So we're going to jump into our logical fallacy of the week. So our logical fallacy of the week is quoting out of context. And you probably already know what this is if you have two brain cells to rub together. But if you quote something, you need to make sure it actually fits into what it said. So there's a context to what's being said. And if you say, you can take something, you could say, somebody could say something awful. They could be quoting somebody else. But then you could take what they're saying, you could cut out the fact that they said they're quoting something else, and you could quote them saying that thing, and you could be like, oh, they say this, and they think that. That's quoting out of context, if you need more information about it. So you're distorting what somebody else is saying, which is kind of jerky if you think about it. This is also a false attribution. So it's a false attribution fallacy is just inaccurate or misleading information. So I hope that you have a really good week. I just wanted to talk about this because this is something that I've been dealing with a lot in my life. I guess I kind of failed with not getting the episode out 2 weeks ago. And I've failed in a lot of other ways because I just failed to do things, like I failed to act. And as I look back, if you're willing to allow yourself to fail, if you take the burden of I always have to be perfect off your back, it's a lot better. Life is a lot better. It's a lot less worrisome because you're like, well, I may fail, but I have extra chances to do stuff. And I don't know. I think it's a better way of thinking. I think it's so much better than just thinking, oh, I can't do anything. Because even if you try something, like if you fail, you fail. Technically, I went to school, I got a degree, and I failed to make the right choices with that degree. And I hate it. I hate it so much. But at the same time, I learned a lot, and I probably wouldn't be the same place I am today. So I don't know. That's all I've got for you today. I know I went a little over, but that's it. So like always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.